Hello and welcome to Morphology, the study of the structure of words. Polonius to Hamlet. What is that you read, my lord? Hamlet to Polonius. Words, words, words. Yeah, well, what else would you be reading if not words? And of course this isn't the question Polonius is really asking. What is the content of what you are reading is what he's really asking. And the answer is a typical Hamlet move. It's as though Hamlet is saying, look, there are many perspectives on reality and there is no such thing as a neutral question. Our questions already presuppose a certain kind of answer, a certain way of looking at things. And it is a linguistic perspective that makes us attend not just to the meaning of language, but to the structures behind how it means. And with morphology, it does this by having us consider such things as words. But do we read words? Was a word? What's a word? What is a word? There, I've asked the question 3 times. What words have been used for me to ask this question? In this presentation we look at this notion of word then and see that when it comes down to it, there are going to be 2 distinct functional aspects to consider. I'm going to summarize what they are, and don't worry if it feels a little bit abstract and esoteric. By the end of the presentation I'm hoping it will make perfect sense, but here they are. There are 2 functional aspects to consider then. Number 1, the capacity of certain parts of words to form or derive new words. And number 2, the capacity of certain word forms to signal how a word is to be taken in a larger speech unit. In the more highfalutin terminology of linguistics, these are respectively the derivational and the inflectional functions of, I'm not even going to say the word words here, morphemes. That's the term of art that we're going to learn about. So exploring a word form is going to involve us learning about morphemes. It's also going to get us into exploring word type, what traditionally is called parts of speech. Linguists these days tend to prefer to call them word classes. More on that too. Alright, all of this though presupposes that the concept of word makes sense. So was a word? Did you hear any breaks in my articulation of the question? If you are relatively new to English, you can imagine how troublesome it is to hear this as being made up of separate units. What's or what is a word? Clearly then, words are more associated with written language than with spoken language. So through exposure to written language, children start to adopt the conventions of writing, including, importantly, putting spaces between words. The spaces make reading easier. But even in writing, it's not always easy to see what should be considered a single word. Is a compound like merry-go-round 1 word or 3, for example? Which of the following would you call a single word? Now, linguists doing morphology want to talk about morphemes rather than words. A morpheme is a single unit of meaning. So let's take the word trees in the list. Linguists would say, well, that word, trees, is actually comprised of 2 morphemes, tree and s. Even though it's 1 syllable, and let's take the one beneath it, person, that's 2 syllables, but that one, person, consists only of 1 morpheme, person. So when you look at these words, you can see that some parts are added to these words that seem to be made up of more than one. Start again. And when you look at the list, there seems to be some parts added to some of these words, or they seem to be made up of more than one word. They're like compound words. All of which would suggest that they're not pure then. There's no such thing as a kind of a pure word. We've got some things to sort out here, and that's what morphology is going to help us with. So, words then, what are they exactly? Well, here's one way to think about it. They're perceptual units. They're not physical units. Recall the analogy that I used when we did the phonology presentation, the rainbow analogy. When people speak, they certainly cause sound waves to travel through the air, but it's the interpretation of speech, perceiving these sound waves as individual words or phrases, that's important. When we looked into phonology, that approach showed us that we don't hear the full spectrum or continuum of speech sounds. We select or adjust our perception to only those sounds that have meaningful significance in the system. That's i.e. the phonemes. We hear selectively, in other words. That's why it's hard to learn a new language, one of the reasons. It involves not only learning what to pay attention to, but just as importantly, what to ignore. It's almost like we've got to retrain our ears, so to speak. Well, similarly then, with words, and in a parallel way to the approach used by phonology and phonemics, morphologists have posited the morpheme. So what's a morpheme? Well, they're the smallest units of meaning in words. So that means not only should we consider some words as, say, compound words, two words joined together, but really made up of two separate meaning units, as in anywhere, but we should also pay attention to elements like the letter S at the end of trees. It makes a meaningful difference whether we are talking about a tree or trees, right? Well, all this means then that, amongst other things, my dog does not hear words as I do. Morphemes are the smallest units of meaning in words. If I say walk, walks, or walkies, it's all the same to him. So just to clinch all this then, let's take this word here, bones. It's made up of two morphemes, bone plus S. But notice a difference here between these two morphemes. The bone part stands by itself, but the S, though it adds meaning to bone, does not stand alone. In other words, it needs to be attached to a root word in order to perform its function. In this case, it has the function of signalling plurality. Well, in linguistic terms, we can say that bone is an example of a free morpheme, while S is a bound morpheme. So let's just clinch this before going on. I'd like you to press the pause button in a minute, divide the words below into their component morphemes, and then once you've done that, return. So I've bold-faced the root words and put a space between the phonemes. Notice that a morpheme is not equivalent to a syllable. I know I've said that before, but that's important. Also notice that the word thickeners is a word comprising of three morphemes. Okay. We still need to say a bit more about morphemes. And this goes back to that rather abstract thing I said right at the beginning of the presentation. Morphemes do two things that are distinct. They have, number one, a constructional function, helping to signal what the word means. And they also, number two, have a grammatical function, signalling how a word functions in a sentence. Let's unpack these functions a little bit more. What does it mean, first of all, to say a morpheme has this constructional meaning? We're going to take the first one first. I can accept something. Now let's focus on this word accept. Or I can find the whole thing acceptable. The able morpheme, a suffix, changes the root word accept from something which meant receiving with approval, that's basically what accept means, receiving with approval, to something like capable of being received with approval. See that? So in the second sample then, accept, the root accept, is now a quality and not simply an action, an act. There's an important shift then in meaning between these two words, accept and acceptable. Furthermore, I can find the whole thing unacceptable. Now the un, the un morpheme, a prefix, has changed the root word's meaning again to something that does not have the quality of acceptance. In other words then, lexical or derivational morphology, to use the linguistic terminology, studies how words are built up out of new elements to construct new meanings. There's lots of examples of this on the handouts that go with this presentation. Let's take another example to get us to see the other morphemic function. Here is a book, and I've always thought it, Samantha is bookish. Notice the root word for both is book, a free morpheme, but what does the suffix ish do to its meaning? You could say that book is a thing, whereas bookish is the quality of being devoted to such things. Book and bookish then have different meanings. In this example, the root word functioning as a noun in the first statement has changed its meaning. Incidentally, it's also now functioning as an adjective, but we'll come back to that later on. Alright, now consider this. Here are some books. Let's compare these two for a minute. The morpheme suffix s has done what to the root word book? Importantly, notice that it hasn't changed the meaning. We're still dealing with the things called books. Only now we're to take these things in a plural way. The S then functions to signal plurality. Alright, look at this example. The book's plot was riveting. Are we still talking about things called books? Absolutely. The meaning hasn't changed. So what role then is the S suffix playing now? And notice it's preceded by an apostrophe so we don't confuse it with the plural S. Well, basically the S is saying that the riveting plot belongs to the book. So the use of S is inflectional. It functions to signal how a word is to be taken in terms of things like singularity versus plurality, case, tense. In fact, that's all it is. In other words, it has a grammatical function rather than a meaning or semantic function. Whereas the other examples that we've seen, the other examples of morphemes, are of the derivational kind. So now we can say that inflectional morphology studies the way words vary through form to express grammatical function. So let's summarise all this and see how words are formed in English. We start with the free morpheme, a word unit that can stand alone, like book, bone, accept, read. These can be affixed either with a prefix, a bound morpheme that comes before a free morpheme, like the un, the un in unacceptable, or a suffix that comes after the free morpheme, like the s in books, signalling that we need to take the word as a plural, or the ish in bookish, changing the meaning of book from meaning a thing to meaning the quality of devotion to such a thing. The affixes of the first kind are inflectional and have a grammatical function rather than changing the meaning of the root word. Notice that these inflectional affixes add to the root but do not change the part of speech that it belongs to. Also notice that we can list all the inflectional suffixes of English, and here they are. That is a comprehensive list of inflectional prefixes in English. There are no inflectional prefixes. There are only inflectional suffixes. No inflectional prefixes in English. In other languages have inflectional prefixes, but not English. The affixes of the second kind, the derivational suffix, like er added to the verb work, produces worker. The root morpheme, which originally meant the act of doing a particular activity, work, is now a kind of thing rather than activity. So this is reflected then in the change in the parts of speech that work and worker respectively belong to. The verb work compared to the noun worker. By the way, the process of transforming a word or phrase to a noun or noun phrase is called nominalization. I'm only mentioning it now to put the seed in your mind concerning academic writing. Academic writing tends to be highly nominalized. That is, it tends to have a lot of noun phrases in its structure. Why is that, do you think? We're going to look more closely at this in a future presentation. Alright, a comparable story to derivational suffixes can be told regarding the addition of derivational prefixes, like un in untie. Meaning has been changed pretty radically here, though here notice the part of speech is the same. Tie and untie are verbs. This is consistent with all the derivational prefixes in English. Alright, let's have some fun with all this. Here's a word. Let's take it as a free morpheme. Press the pause button after you've heard these instructions, and then come back. But what I want you to do is see what derivational affixes, both prefixes and suffixes, can be added to this root word to derive as many new words as possible. Alright, so here's one analysis. The derivational, let me say this first. In the readings that go with this presentation, I provided examples of all the inflectional affixes and a long list of the derivational ones. And I hope all this has sparked some interest in terms of you doing your own investigations. And I hope you can see that if you're a language learner, taking an interest in morphological resources, the affixes, could be a very helpful thing to do. The derivational affixes far outnumber the inflectional ones. What does this mean? Well, it shows that English isn't a very inflected language, unlike, say, Latin. Amongst other things, this means that it relies very heavily then on syntax or word order to achieve grammatical function. As it's explained in the readings, English is an analytic language rather than a synthetic one. Well, I'd like to end this morphology presentation with saying a few things about categorizing word types, or parts of speech as it's traditionally called. Linguists prefer to call it word classes because traditional grammar has defined parts of speech in very unscientific and sometimes rather confusing ways. What are the word classes? The basic ones, the major ones. Well, here are the major ones. Every language has some a way of accounting for these. I'm going to add this too. So these are the four major categories, and the best way to explain them is to see them in action. In fact, an important point to consider when you're teaching grammar is to use lots of parallel examples that can demonstrate or show a pattern or principle rather than focus on a rule, right? But just take this then to demonstrate this. To demonstrate these word classes. Agile termites crawl over concrete. It's made up of adjective, noun, verb, preposition, noun. So it has the syntactical pattern ANVPN. Before we go into what these classes mean, I want you to notice something about what is behind this aspect of linguistic inquiry. Does this seem familiar? Does it remind you of this? I know that this is phonology. It shows that in the word environment p, vowel slot, t, you could have a number of possible phonemes. Well, a very important figure in the history of linguistics, the Swiss linguist Ferdinand Saussure, 1857 to 1913, who more or less founded structural linguistics, so he's a very important figure in the history of linguistics, saw that there are two dimensions to the language system: a horizontal or syntagmatic relationship and a vertical or paradigmatic relationship. In other words, when elements combine along the horizontal dimension, they're said to be in syntagmatic relationship. So the phonemes p, a and t combine syntagmatically to form the word pat. But as we can see, the phoneme I can also appear in this syntagmatic environment to form pit. And there are other possibilities too. So elements which have the potential for appearance in the same environment in this way, in the same slot so to speak, are said to be in paradigmatic relationship. Well, the same structure is true when the elements are not sounds but word units or phonemes. Let's spread this sentence out a little. The ANVPN syntagmatic structure that this sentence has, well, it allows for paradigmatic possibility. Let's explore the paradigmatic possibility of this syntagmatic structure. Adjectives would go in the first syntagmatic slot. Nouns next. Then verbs, prepositions, and a noun at the end. Agile termites crawl over concrete. Lazy lions swim on ice. Blue pimples cook under. You can fill it in. So I've left some spaces there for you to try your own ideas. Does all this remind you of a famous game that some of you may have played, or do play with kids? Isn't it just like Mad Libs, right? Well, now you can say that Mad Libs is based on the syntagmatic and paradigmatic structure of language. Wow. Well, all right, maybe you wouldn't want to say that, but you can see that, this is really powerful and perhaps hints at a way of approaching the teaching of grammar that would be different to the deadly kind where students are made to identify correct parts of speech. Instead, we could ask our students to have fun and generate language possibilities, including bizarre sentences, as long as they were sentences. And have them start to notice and get a feel to what kind of words fit in particular syntagmatic slots. Producing language by being attuned to the structural affordances of the language strikes me as a far more educational thing than just an exercise in correct identification. And we want the kids to feel the joy of experimentation, right? Well, what do you think? How would you use Saussure's structural insight in the classroom? Alright, well, let's go back to parts of speech. Why do we have students identify parts of speech? I'll let the readings that accompany this presentation complicate this question for us, but here I just want to point out a few things. Words are usually classified on account of their syntactic behaviour and their morphological form. We'll start with those two anyway. For example, the word class traditionally known as verb can be recognised as a verb partly because it occurs after nouns or noun phrases. Samantha loved the movie. George laughed. In both of these cases, the verbs loved and laughed follow the nouns, Samantha and George. But also verbs can be recognised because most of them have an inflectional ending, such as ed, to indicate the past. Is this always true? Well, let's try it with nouns. Abdul ate apples. Abdul ate well. Because apples is a noun, we might be tempted to think that any word occupying the same slot will be a noun. So, well must be a noun. But this isn't right, because if we do a bit more juggling, the second sentence has an asterisk preceding it to indicate that it's really ungrammatical. If we can say apples were eaten by Abdul, we should be able to say well was eaten by Abdul if well functions in the same way that apples function, and of course we can't. It doesn't make sense. Similarly, with even more juggling, what Abdul ate were apples, we can say. What Abdul ate was well does not make sense. What we have to conclude then is that apples and well are syntactically different and belong to different word classes. It's this kind of playing, though, that's going to be very important to really get a feel for how a word is syntactically behaves. Seeing how a word behaves syntactically, its relation to other words, is really essential for identifying the word class it belongs to. Consider the word well in these sentences. You can see that it can play any of these roles. An adverb modifying the verb, an adjective modifying the noun, the subject or object of a clause. So let's get back to the two criteria for classification that I mentioned earlier. Is there anything else we might add? Yes. Basically, the kind of meaning a word has. So, for example, a noun is a person, place, or thing. I'm sure that's pretty familiar to most of us. But note that in italics, I've added some extra things which the definitions in the traditional grammar books usually leave out. For noun, we should also include abstract quality like beauty, the beauty, and actions like thump, like the thump. A verb is a word that shows action. That's true. But some verbs also refer to states like knowing and being. So I've written there and states. I should have written like states like knowing and being. Oh well. An adjective serves to describe people, places and things. And of course that's okay so long as we include those abstract qualities I mentioned with nouns. And finally, adverbs provide extra information about actions. So are there any other types of words? Well, of course there are. We've mentioned one other already, prepositions, words that go before noun phrases to show what relation the person or thing stands to something else. Words like in, on, to, about, before. But there are really a whole slew of what linguists call function words. What are the function words? Determiners, quantifiers, pronouns. From a syntactic point of view, all those words signal that a noun is coming or actually replace the noun. And there are also intensifiers, particles, conjunctions, prepositions, and a subclass of verbs called auxiliaries or helper verbs. All these are described in the reading material for this that goes with this presentation, so I'm not going to go into explaining each one of these here. But I want to end by giving you a taste for the relative importance of these function words. Telegram. Okay, here's a blast from the past. I know it's hard sometimes to think that we did once live in a pre-digital age, and live quite well actually, but it's true, we did. There was a time when sending a telegram was the fastest and surest way of getting a message to someone. And because you had to pay for the telegram by the amount of text you wrote, you tended to write messages that were very sparse. It's sort of like the equivalent to the text messaging style used today in tweets and Facebook and so on. Okay, I want you to imagine this message was sent to someone to inform them about what actually happened with a group of young people who intended to go camping but ended up doing something else. Here it is. Of course, we could clip this even further and still get the message across, but I think you can maybe make sense of what the message is. So this isn't really telegraph talk, but I want to stop with this version, because what I've done in this passage is I've taken out the function words, those types of words that linguists call the function words. And this is actually the original passage, function words being underlined. After it had rained for an hour, the young people gave up their idea of camping out. Instead, they rented a room at a motel where they could swim in a pool and eat by the poolside. After you've read about these function words, maybe you could identify what kinds of function words they are. But really, why I'm showing you this is it begs a question: what does this really tell us about the relative importance of function words? Can we work out the relevant function word from the surrounding content words? All right. I think this is enough for this presentation. Basically, I think it's really important that you find your own ways of absorbing and playing with all this material, and I know there's a lot of it, and especially taking to heart that notion of the syntagmatic paradigmatic structure of language, because it's not just a clever insight about language. I think it also holds promise for looking at language in a more playful, productive and curious way. I hope you can see that. And I hope that the activities that go with this presentation will encourage some creative inquiry and act as the prelude perhaps for considering how such experiences might also be gifted to our students. So, as the sun sets and the moon rises, as always, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Take care and see you next time.